Hello class, this is Professor McDonald, and this will be my professor comments from Chapter 8. This chapter is titled Crimes of Violence. And when we're talking about crimes of violence, what we're talking about is crimes against person, homicide, child abuse, assaults, stalking. These are typical crimes that are included in the crimes against person category. A lot of your police departments are actually divided into squads, and some squads investigate crimes against persons. Some might be assigned to crimes against property, say for example, burglary, car theft, that sort of thing. I know when I was with NCIS at Camp Lejeune, I worked on the crimes against person squad when we were subdivided in that nature. So I'm going to try to hit a little quick overview of some of the key points in this chapter. The chapter is really well written. It's very easy to follow. But let me just explain some of the key topics that are included in the chapter. When we're talking about criminal homicide, normally the statutes themselves are divided into various degrees. First-degree murder, second-degree murder, and then manslaughter, of which there are two types. When we're talking about first-degree murder, which separates it from the other potential crimes, is the fact, the planning aspect of it. First-degree murder is defined as the premeditated killing of another human being with malice or wrongful intent. In other words, you kill somebody and you plan on killing them. There's an intent. There's a as the term they use, a premeditation aspect to it. And that separates it from the other criminal homicides. Second-degree murder is described as the killing of another but without the element of premeditation. And then you have manslaughter. Manslaughter is defined as the unlawful killing of another without malice or premeditation, either voluntarily or involuntary. So how do we explain the two different types of manslaughter? Let me give you an example. We had a case at Camp Lejeune where a young Marine had been deployed, and he got back a day or two early. And when he walked into his home, his wife was not expecting him on that date, and she was in bed with another man having sexual relations. Well, he had a shotgun right there at the door. He grabbed it, walked in, and shot her and killed her right on the spot. He also shot the other individual, but he was able to escape out the back door. Now, there was no premeditation aspect to this killing. It was a crime of passion, and therefore manslaughter was the charge that he was ultimately charged with. Now, involuntary manslaughter would be something, if you're driving, good example they give in the book, you're driving while intoxicated and somebody dies as a result of your negligence. The corpus delicti of all criminal homicides comprises the following. You have to show in the evidence that the death of a human being, of a criminal agency, and what that means is that death was caused by another person's unlawful act or commission, and that the criminal agency or other person was the proximate cause of the death. Now, many times, homicides, they just start off as suspicious death investigations. Whenever you get a call that a body has been found, at that point, you don't assume anything, but even if it appears, say, for example, to be a suicide, you cannot assume that it's a suicide until you do your investigation. You have to let the evidence take you to where it needs to be. Now, let me just mention quickly, on page 161 of the text, there's a very good checklist for the investigation of criminal homicide. There's the various steps, starting with the discovery of crime to the crime scene, etc. Make sure you're familiar with that, because that gives you a good overview of how these cases evolve. Now, what you have to remember also is, you know how important the crime scene is. Well, the body is a crime scene. It's part of that crime scene. And many times if the person, when you respond to the crime scene, if the person is definitely dead, somebody has declared him as being dead, he may lay there for a while before he's actually moved. And of course, what you're trying to do is reconstruct the crime scene, gather as much evidence as you possibly can. Part of the crime scene examination is the autopsy, which is the post-mortem examination of the victim, especially in a suspicious death case. The autopsy is performed by a competent physician. Could be a surgeon, could be a pathologist, could be a local coroner. Just depends on the jurisdiction where the case is being investigated. And their job is to report the nature of the death. Is this an accidental death? Is it a suicide? Is it a criminal homicide? A very important aspect of the investigation. If you're the lead investigator on the case, then you will be asked to attend the autopsy. I've attended autopsies, and there's a variety of reasons. You learn a lot about the victim and a lot about the crime at the autopsy. There may be evidence that you recover from the body. I mean, it could be something like a bullet. It could be hair fibers. It could be blood fibers. It could be skin taken from underneath the nails, say, of a sexual assault or an assault victim. So your participation in this process is vital to doing a professional investigation. And again, the autopsy is a very critical part of that investigation. And there are a lot of different things that you'll look at. I know the first one I ever attended, we had a victim who had been murdered at Camp Lejeune. He'd been stabbed many times. Well, at the autopsy, I was able to learn by examining the depth of the stab wounds. I learned a lot from that. I learned probably the type of weapon that was used. In that particular case, the individual was killed not only with a knife but also with a hammer. And I was able to collect information relative to the crime at that point, and other very valuable information that you can get. You might see defense wounds on the body where you can tell that there was a struggle. These are all things that help you as an investigator. They generate leads to try to solve the case and try to reconstruct exactly what happened. I'm not going to go into all the details of what occurs at an autopsy, but believe me, there's a lot of work that's done in the total examination of the body. Toxicology is another part of it. If there's any sort of chemical, physical, or biological toxins that maybe are part of the investigation. Let's say you have a poisoning case. Well, a person that might appear to be a person that died of natural causes, it might turn out they were poisoned. And so that's why this autopsy is so critical. Another challenge that occurs at times is a body is found and you have no idea who the person is. And so there are a lot of things that go into investigating the identity. They talk in here in the textbook about death mask, which would be trying to reconstruct some sort of caricature on what the person looked like and posted that in flyers and circulating that to police officers and also to the public at times. Again, once you identify who the victim is, for sure, and most of the time you know who it is, but there are times when maybe skeletal remains are recovered, this sort of thing, where the investigators have to work a little bit harder and try to find out who the victim is before they can move forward with their investigation. Because obviously, once you know who the victim is, that generates a lot of investigative leads that need to be followed. Also, a critical area, and in this identification, they can look at fingerprints, they can look at dental work, they can look at the bones themselves, which can indicate the sex, height, and age of a victim. Whether a person had surgery before, if you can identify the victim, and maybe they have they had a hip replace, something like this. These are all things that can lead the investigation to be able to determine how to identify the body, because at times in criminal homicide, the perpetrators will actually burn the bodies, and there's a picture of one of those victims on page 159. And of course, the purpose of this is to try to cover up evidence from the crime scene and make it more difficult for the investigators. The body itself will tell you a lot. One of the things that's important to try to establish is the time of death, and they look at things like algor mortis, which is body temperature, rigor mortis, which is the stiffening of muscles, lividity. These are all physical changes that occur in the body after death, and these things are very vital to the investigation and why it's so important that pathologist and that investigator work hand in hand. I've never had the occasion to have to do this, but there are times when a court order is obtained for an exhumation of a body. Let's say, for example, there's a death that occurs that initially appears to be a natural cause death, which would not be a criminal homicide, but information is later determined that maybe the individual involved has killed other people, and this person could also be a potential victim, and so a body could be exhumed, and then a toxicology report done to see if they can determine whether this person also was victimized by a perpetrator through poisoning, something like this. Again, I haven't personally been involved in this, but I know that it does occur, especially sometimes, like, for example, in serial cases, serial murder cases. There's some good description, again, on page 161 as to how the investigation proceeds. I'm not going to review that to you. You can read that on your own. Different types of criminal homicide. People get mad at people. A lot of times, as you know, in most homicides, the victim and the suspect know each other. You have the triangle killing, where you can have the love triangle, which ultimately results in violence against one of the individuals. Revenge, jealousy killing, killing for profit. Random killing. So there's a lot of different types. Murder, suicide, we read about them every day. And what I think I mentioned this earlier, felony murder, and that's where a person's death results during the commission of a felony. For example, an armed robbery of a bank, and one of the people in the bank gets shot by one of the robbers. Well, that's felony murder. That's equivalent to first-degree murder, and a very serious crime. Key thing is, as a homicide investigator, is you always have to keep an open mind. You have to let the evidence take you where it will take you. Don't form opinions too quickly, and because an investigation may appear to fit one of the criminal homicide patterns and then take a whole different direction. So that's why it's important to keep to have highly professional people, and normally my experience is the individuals within a police department or a federal agency that work homicide are normally the top echelon professionals within that organization, because these are very, very important cases. And I know from my experience, when we had a homicide, everybody stopped what they were doing and chipped in to assist. Motive is something you don't have to prove, but it's a nice thing to know. And motive is useful and necessary in the sense that basic leads can be developed from the motive, if you can find it. And of course, juries always want to know why a person did what they did. Multicide is the killing of a number of victims by one or more persons working in concert. And this is where you get your mass murder, the homicide of 4 or more victims during a single event. Your spree murder, like the DC murder, could go over a period of weeks. Your serial killers, some of them like Ted Bundy, Gary Ridgway, they killed over long periods of time in multiple locations. So make sure you take a look at those and know the differences between them. One of the great things I think has emerged in the last couple of decades is the development of cold case investigations, even cold case teams. Because of the advances of science and forensics, we see a lot of departments have cold case units where they can actually go back and look at cases again with the new advances we have and identify and resolve cases, which is great for families that perhaps had a person in their family victimized and there was never a resolution to the case. And so with this way, this is an advance, I think, in law enforcement that is a very strong positive. Stalking, I'll let you read about that. Most of you know what that is. And there's different types of stuff. You even have cyber stalking today. I don't think they mention that in the textbook, where people stalk people, using cell phones and computers, etc. Assault is also a crime against person. Assault is the unlawful attempt coupled with the ability to commit an injury on another person. And the actual physical contact, the unlawful beating or other wrongful physical harm, is called the battery. So you can have an assault without a battery, and you can have assault and a battery. What they mean by coupled with present ability is a person has to have the ability to carry out the assault. For example, if you have a 5-year-old boy tell a professional football player that he's going to assault him with his hands, well, that all sounds well and good, but does he really have the present ability to carry out the act? And that's what they mean by that. But just remember, an attempt, maybe you take a swing at a person, and you don't actually strike them, then you could be charged with assault. But if you actually hit that person, you could be charged with assault and battery. Now, here's what's important to remember. In a lot of states, depending on where you're working, the statute might just read assault, but it includes battery. I'm just separating them here because that's the way it's described in the textbook. And in some states, it's actually listed as assault and battery. Normally, a fist fight would be a simple assault, which is a misdemeanor in most jurisdictions. If it becomes a much more serious crime, if somebody uses a baseball bat or they pull a gun on somebody, then it becomes aggravated assault. And there are other crimes you could also be charged with. If you shoot somebody and you don't kill them, they could also charge you with attempted murder, but also along with aggravated assault and battery. Child abuse is another crime that fits this category, and there's a good explanation. And of course, child abuse is the intentional and deliberate assault upon a child in which seriously bodily injury is inflicted by a parent, a foster parent, a babysitter, or some other person in a non-parental relationship. And so, believe it or not, and I'm sure most of you know that, children are frequently the targets of violent crime. I worked a child homicide case once on a baby that was not even 3 months old, who'd actually been, the manner in which he had been treated by the parents, he'd actually been murdered. And I remember, I'll never forget that call, getting a call from the forensic pathologist on the military base. He told me to come down and said he had a bad one, and I had the duty that day. So children, yes, they can become the victims of child abuse, and in that case, it was murder. You have battered child syndrome. Burn injuries make up child abuse cases. I know I worked a case once where the parents actually put cold ice to burn the back of this child. It was really a strange deal the way they did it. And then sometimes children are placed in, are put in tubs that are very where the water is scalding. So children, just remember this, children can be the victims of these crimes. One of the difficult things there is, and this is probably not discussed in the book that I ran into, is sometimes the parents don't want to, if one parent is the abuser and the other one is not, the one who's not the abuser many times doesn't want to testify or get involved in the investigation against the other parent. So it can become a real frustrating type of investigation. There are also things such as shaken baby syndrome, Munchausen syndrome, sudden infant death syndrome. So make sure you're familiar with those terms in your readings. And I believe I've covered the things that I want to discuss with this chapter, and that will end this dictation.